The organ music swelled through the marble cathedral of San Lorenzo, vibrating through the stone floor and into the soles of my worn leather shoes, and I pressed my back against the cold vestibule wall, so hard I thought I might fuse with it. I was holding a wilted rose, just one. My fingers were white-knuckled around the stem, the thorns digging into my palm, drawing tiny beads of blood I couldn't feel because my entire body had gone numb approximately 47 minutes ago, when I had arrived at the cathedral in a faded plum dress, without jewelry, without makeup, without invitation, and watched my younger sister walk down the aisle, wearing my wedding gown to marry the man who had been promised to me. Viviana stood at the altar, looking like something painted by a Renaissance master. Ivory silk and delicate lace, the gown catching the light that poured through San Lorenzo's famous stained glass windows and turning her into something ethereal, something luminous, something so heartbreakingly beautiful that every guest in the cathedral inhaled when she smiled. I knew exactly how that silk felt against the skin. I knew because the dress had been fitted to my body 3 weeks ago. The seamstress, a patient old woman named Signora Capelli, who had been making bridal gowns for 40 years, had pricked my thumb while pinning the hem, leaving a microscopic drop of blood on the inner lining that Viviana would never know was there. My blood, in my dress, on my sister's body, at my wedding. They hadn't even asked me. That was the part that still burned, not like fire but like ice, the slow, creeping freeze of a betrayal so casual it didn't even require the courtesy of a conversation. My mother had cornered me in my bedroom 11 days ago. Her words still rang in my ears, coated in maternal concern that disguised the underlying cruelty the way perfume disguises rot. Isadora, darling, you must be reasonable. You've never been the social type. And Don Drago, well, he requires a wife who can host, who can dazzle. You are so wonderfully intelligent, but you lack Viviana's radiance. The contracts are in my name, Mother, I had replied. My voice was remarkably steady, despite the sudden freezing sensation spreading through my chest, like winter arriving 3 months early. Names can be amended. Your father has already spoken to the Drago family's consigliere. It is a minor clerical adjustment. Don Drago simply wants a Santoro bride. He hardly knows the difference between you two. They had simply taken the future that was contractually mine and handed it to the favored child, the way they had taken the bedroom with the view when Viviana turned 14, the way they had taken my university fund for Viviana's wardrobe when I was 19, the way they had taken and taken and taken, slowly, systematically, with polite smiles and logical arguments, until there was nothing left of Isadora Santoro except a quiet, plus-size, ink-stained girl standing in the shadows of a cathedral, watching her own life be given away. Viviana had cried, of course, feigning guilt while her eyes shone with triumph. I couldn't bear to take him from you, Dora, but Mama says it's for the best of the family. Now the family was seated in the front pew. My father, Don Antonio Santoro, looked smug, his chest puffed out, his red face glistening with sweat, his expensive suit 2 decades past its prime, the specific appearance of a man whose wealth was a performance hiding catastrophic debt. My mother, Luciana, was weeping delicate manufactured tears into a silk handkerchief, dabbing at eyes that had never once cried for me. They had gotten exactly what they wanted, a dazzling bride for a daughter, and a quiet, compliant spinster left to manage the household accounts that nobody else in the family could understand, because nobody else in the family had bothered to learn arithmetic. I squeezed my eyes shut. I wasn't sad. Sadness implied the loss of something I had loved. I had never even spoken to Don Drago. No, what I felt was a profound, suffocating anger, an anger at the world, at the rules that dictated a woman's worth, was measured in the symmetry of her face and the number on her dress size. I was 26. Too old, they said. Too plain, too heavy, too sharp-tongued. Viviana was 21, a blooming rose. The world made way for roses. It stepped on the thorns. A sudden shift in the atmosphere pulled me from my thoughts. The whispering stopped. Not gradually, not the slow fade of conversation settling into polite attention. It was a sheer drop into absolute silence, the kind of silence that happens when something dangerous enters a room, and every survival instinct in every human body simultaneously says, "Don't move." The heavy doors at the side of the altar swung open. I opened my eyes. Don Cassian Drago had arrived. He did not walk like a man approaching his wedding. He walked like a man inspecting a battlefield, each step deliberate, measured, the polished black boots striking marble with a sharp, rhythmic precision that echoed through the cathedral like a countdown. Click, click, click. He was dressed in a black three-piece suit over a black shirt, with no tie, impeccably tailored, every line of the fabric engineered to contain the architecture beneath it, without disguising its scale. And the scale was extraordinary. 6 feet 5 inches, 260 pounds. Shoulders so broad they cast their own shadow, a chest that tapered into a hard waist, with the geometric precision of a man whose body was not decorative but operational, built for function, built for authority, built to be the last person standing in any room that required standing. His face was carved stone. Jet black hair cropped close at the sides, longer on top, combed back with severe precision. Dark green eyes, the specific, unsettling green of deep forest water, sweeping over the congregation with a chilling indifference. A white scar bisected his left eyebrow, old, faded, the remnant of a lesson learned violently and remembered permanently. He did not look nervous. He looked thoroughly, dangerously bored. He moved toward the altar. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic strike of his boots against the floor. Click, click, click. It sounded like a clock counting down to something nobody in the room was prepared for. At the altar, Viviana adjusted her posture. She tipped her chin up, offering him her best, most angelic smile. The smile that had won her every trinket she had ever demanded, every room she had ever entered, every person she had ever charmed. It was the smile of a 21-year-old girl who had never encountered a situation her beauty couldn't solve. My father beamed. My mother dabbed her eyes with renewed vigor. Cassian stopped at the base of the altar steps. He stood perfectly still. His massive frame was motionless, the absolute, controlled stillness of a predator who has identified something wrong and is deciding how to respond. He did not smile back. The priest, a small, nervous man sweating profusely in his heavy vestments, cleared his throat and stepped forward, opening his prayer book. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God. Hold. The word was not shouted. It was spoken in a low, resonant baritone that carried effortlessly to the very back of the cathedral, to the vestibule where I stood, pressed against the wall, forgotten, but it cracked like a whip. The priest froze, his mouth hanging open mid-sentence. The congregation inhaled a collective sharp breath, 200 people breathing in at the same time, the sound like a wave pulling back from shore before it crashes. Viviana's smile faltered, her perfectly painted lips parting in confusion. "Your Grace," she murmured. Cassian did not look at the priest. He finally looked directly at Viviana. He studied her face, her dress, the diamond sparkling at her throat. His expression did not soften. It hardened, the way steel hardens when it cools, becoming something sharper and less forgiving. It was the look of a man who had purchased a thoroughbred and been presented with a pony dressed in ribbons. "You are not Isadora." The statement was flat, devoid of question, a fact delivered with the same clinical precision as a medical diagnosis. Viviana's eyes widened, flashing with sudden raw panic. She looked desperately toward our mother in the front pew. Luciana half rose from her seat, her face draining of color faster than her blood could keep up with. My father stepped out of the pew, his voice thick with forced joviality, his face already shifting to the mottled purple of a man whose performance is collapsing in real time. "Don Drago, a minor alteration to the arrangements, as my consigliere informed yours. Viviana is our youngest, a far more suitable match, I assure you. Isadora is indisposed." Cassian turned his head slowly to look at my father. The sheer contempt in those dark green eyes made the older man physically recoil. Stepping backward so quickly, he almost tripped over the pew. "I did not agree to a minor alteration, Don Santoro." Cassian's voice dropped an octave, vibrating with a quiet, terrifying menace that made the candle flames along the aisle seem to dim. "I signed a blood contract for Isadora Santoro, the woman who wrote the restructuring addendums for the Santoro supply chain, the woman whose financial projections across 14 distribution points were the only reason I agreed to this alliance, the woman whose handwriting was precise and whose strategic demands were brutally pragmatic." He turned his gaze back to Viviana, who was now trembling visibly in my stolen silk. "I do not want a suitable match. I do not want a decoration dressed in a gown that was not made for her body. I want the woman who built your family's accounts while you spent the profits." Viviana let out a strangled sob, stepping backward as if physically struck, her heel catching on the too long hem of my gown, nearly sending her tumbling down the altar steps. The cathedral erupted. 200 guests gasped. Whispers became shouts. My mother shrieked, collapsing backward into the pew. My father's purple face turned white. Cassian ignored them all. He turned his back on the altar. He turned his back on the bride, the priest, and the entire front row of the most powerful families in southern Italy. He began to walk back down the aisle. Click, click, click. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I pressed myself harder against the wall, wishing the shadows would swallow me whole. He couldn't possibly know I was here. I was invisible. I had always been invisible. But Cassian Drago's eyes were not scanning the crowd. They were locked dead ahead, fixed on the dark, recessed archway of the vestibule, the exact spot where I was standing, pressed against cold marble, in a faded plum dress, with a wilted rose crushed in my bleeding fist. He was walking straight toward me. The guests turned in their pews, craning their necks, 200 pairs of eyes following the Mafia boss's path, like spectators at a detonation. Helpless, fascinated, unable to look away. The sea of faces parted, and suddenly the shadows offered no protection. I was exposed, pinned under the collective stare of 200 people and the intense, piercing gaze of Don Cassian Drago. He stopped 2 feet in front of me. Up close, he was even more imposing. I could see the faint stubble along his jawline, the deep exhaustion etched around his eyes, the specific exhaustion of a man who has not slept well since he lost someone, and the rigid tension in his massive shoulders that spoke of a body permanently braced for impact. He looked down at me. I looked up at him. I didn't shrink. I didn't look away. Some part of me, the part that had been managing impossible accounts since I was 19, the part that had survived years of being the shadow behind the spotlight, the part that had learned to stand in rooms where nobody saw her and still remained standing, that part of me raised my chin and met his dark green eyes with my own. "You are Isadora," he stated. "I am," I replied. My voice was remarkably steady. He glanced at my faded plum dress, then at the wilted rose crushed in my fist, then at the ink stains on my fingers that I hadn't been able to scrub off because the financial projections he had just referenced in front of 200 guests were finished at 4 o'clock this morning. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. His face was not built for casual smiling, but the hard lines around his jaw softened infinitesimally. The stone became something warmer, not warm, less cold. "Your family attempted to substitute my bride without my consent," he said, his voice low, meant only for my ears, despite the deathly quiet of the cathedral. "They assumed I was a man who could be blinded by a pretty face. They assumed," I said, "that you were a man, and men are notoriously easy to predict." A genuine spark of amusement flared in his dark green eyes, the first human expression I had seen cross his face since he walked through those doors. It was brief, controlled, the flicker of a match struck in a stone room. But it was real. "I assure you, Miss Santoro, I am highly unpredictable." He paused. "I came here today for the woman who argued with my consigliere over transport route optimization via 6 pages of handwritten analysis. Are you that woman?" "I am." Cassian extended his hand, palm up, massive, steady, certain. "Then let us not waste the priest's time. You are the bride I agreed to, the only one I will take." I stared at his hand. The cathedral held its breath. Behind him, at the front of the aisle, I could hear my father sputtering, my mother wailing, the specific sounds of a performance collapsing. The life I had known, the quiet, overlooked, ink-stained existence of a woman who managed other people's money and wore other people's hand-me-downs, was waiting for me if I refused. But taking his hand meant stepping into the fire. It meant scandal. It meant fury. It meant a marriage to a stranger who had just humiliated my family in front of every powerful name in the region. I looked at his hand. I looked up into his dark, uncompromising green eyes. I slowly uncurled my fingers, letting the wilted rose drop to the marble floor. The small, soft sound it made, the sound of something dead being released, was the loudest thing in the cathedral. I placed my hand in his. His grip was warm, calloused, unyielding. His massive fingers closed around mine with a controlled strength that communicated something words hadn't managed. "I have you. I will not let go." "Very well, Don Drago," I said, stepping out of the shadows. "Let us go get married." The walk back up the aisle took exactly 47 steps. I counted them. I needed the anchor of numbers to keep my mind from splintering. The way I always needed numbers. The way I had clung to ledgers and projections and financial formulas my entire life. Because numbers never lied. Numbers never switched you for a prettier sister. Numbers never looked through you as if you weren't there. My worn leather shoes scraped softly against the marble, a stark contrast to the sharp military click of Cassian's boots. His hand remained firmly wrapped around mine. He did not drag me, nor did he rush. He set a measured, deliberate pace, forcing every guest in every pew to watch, to witness the exact moment the Santoro family's grandest ambition collapsed into ash. At the altar, the tableau of disaster was complete. Viviana had crumpled onto the first step, burying her face in a cloud of ivory silk, my silk, weeping with loud, heaving sobs that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. My mother was fanning herself frantically, her chest heaving as if she might faint. My father stepped into our path, his face a mottled, dangerous purple. "Drago, you cannot be serious. You are making a mockery of this family, of my daughter." Cassian stopped. He looked down at my father, and down was the operative word, because Cassian Drago was 6'5", and Antonio Santoro was 5'8" in his best shoes, and the difference in that moment was not just physical, but existential. "You made a mockery of your daughter, Don Santoro. You made a mockery of a blood contract. You presented me with a substitute bride wearing a stolen dress." Cassian's voice was ice over steel. "I suggest you sit down before I consider this an insult that requires a different kind of response." My father sat down. Cassian and I walked past him. We walked past my weeping sister. We walked past the priest, who was clutching his prayer book like a life raft in a hurricane. And then, standing at the altar of San Lorenzo, me in my faded plum dress, him in his black suit, with 200 stunned guests and the wreckage of a family's betrayal scattered behind us like debris from an explosion, we got married. The priest's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the book. I didn't care. Cassian's hand was steady. His voice was steady. His dark green eyes never left mine. Not once. Not for a single syllable. Not during the vows. Not during the exchange of rings. His family's signet. A roaring dragon clutching a sword. Massive, heavy gold. Far too large for my finger. Secured only by a wrapping of thick thread he produced from his jacket pocket, with a practicality that almost made me smile. Not during the final blessing that made me, legally and irrevocably, the wife of Don Cassian Drago. When the priest said, "You may kiss the bride," Cassian did not kiss me. He looked at me, really looked, the way you look at a person whose face you intend to remember forever, and said quietly, "For only my ears." That comes when it is earned, by both of us. In that moment, standing at the altar in a dress that cost nothing, wearing a ring that didn't fit, married to a man I had never spoken to before today, I felt something I had not felt in 26 years of being Isadora Santoro. I felt seen. The convoy of black armored SUVs drove north for 5 hours. I sat in the back seat wrapped in Cassian's heavy wool overcoat. He had draped it over my shoulders without a word as we left the cathedral, and it smelled of cedar and leather and the specific clean warmth of a man who takes care of his things. My plum dress was hopelessly wrinkled. My hair had come loose from its severe pins, dark auburn waves falling around my shoulders. I looked nothing like a bride. I felt remarkably like myself. "The Drago estate," Cassian said, breaking the silence that had lasted 3 hours. He pointed out the window. I wiped the condensation from the glass. The estate did not look like the ornate Mediterranean villas my father fawned over in magazines. The Drago compound was a fortress, dark, rough-hewn stone, standing stubbornly against the wind on a dramatic coastal cliff. There were no manicured topiary gardens, no decorative fountains, no imported marble columns. There was only the vast, unforgiving expanse of the coast stretching behind it, wild and grey and beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with prettiness and everything to do with endurance. It lacks columns, I noted, my breath fogging the glass again. Columns are for men who don't have to worry about car bombs taking the front entrance off, Cassian replied. His voice was dry. It was the first thing he'd said that sounded like humor. You are painting a grim picture, Don Drago. I am painting an honest one. I told you in those contract negotiations, through 6 pages of handwritten analysis, that I needed a partner. Not an ornament. He paused. This estate destroys ornaments. The gates opened. The convoy pulled into the courtyard. A heavy oak door swung open before we had even stopped, light spilling out into the harsh coastal evening, framing the silhouettes of waiting household staff. Cassian stepped out into the wind and turned, offering me his hand. I took it, ignoring the gusts tearing at my plum dress, ignoring the spray of ocean salt on my face, and let him lead me toward the entrance. We crossed the threshold into a cavernous entrance hall, dominated by a massive stone fireplace. A line of staff stood at rigid attention, practical, heavy uniforms, no gold braid, no pretense. At the head of the line stood a tall, sharp-featured woman with iron-gray hair, pulled back tightly, the housekeeper, Mrs. Ferretti. Mrs. Ferretti, Cassian addressed her. This is the Duchess, the Donna of the Drago household. She will have full access to every operational record, every financial ledger, every account. Whatever she requires, provide it. Whatever she demands, fulfill it. Mrs. Ferretti's eyes swept over me, my wrinkled plum dress, my loose auburn hair, my ink-stained fingers, the oversized dragon signet ring held to my finger by thread. Her expression did not change, but something in her posture shifted, a subtle straightening, a recognition that the woman standing before her was not what anyone had expected, and that this, perhaps, was exactly the point. "Welcome home, Donna Drago," she said. "Home." The word landed differently here, not in the cold marble foyer of my father's house, where home meant the place where I was tolerated, but in this rough stone hall, where home was offered to a stranger in a wrinkled dress and sealed with a title I had earned by being the person nobody else wanted to be. Mrs. Ferretti showed me to my rooms. Not a room, rooms. An entire wing of the fortress, with stone walls softened by heavy tapestries, a fireplace large enough to stand in, a writing desk positioned beside a window that overlooked the cliffs and the wild ocean below. The bed was enormous, a 4-poster carved from dark wood, dressed in clean white linens that smelled of lavender and the specific, wind-scrubbed freshness of salt air. Don Drago requested we prepare the east wing, Mrs. Ferretti said, her voice neutral. The west wing is his. The office is shared. He asked me to ensure you had adequate workspace. She paused, and something in her iron expression flickered. Not warmth exactly, but the recognition of a fellow pragmatist. There are fresh ledgers in the desk, Donna Drago. And ink. He mentioned you would need ink. He had remembered the ink stains on my fingers. The detail was so small, so precise, so entirely unlike anything my family had ever noticed about me, that I had to press my hand against my mouth to stop whatever sound was trying to escape. After Mrs. Ferretti left, I stood at the window for a long time. The wind howled against the glass. The ocean crashed against the cliffs with a violence that was somehow comforting, as if the landscape itself was saying, yes, the world is brutal, but look at me standing anyway. I thought about Viviana in my wedding gown, weeping at the altar. I thought about my mother's manufactured tears. I thought about the 26 years of smaller rooms, borrowed dresses, and the quiet assumption that Isadora would manage the accounts, while Viviana received the credit. Then I sat down at the desk. I opened a fresh ledger. I picked up the pen, and I began. I will not pretend we fell in love immediately. That would be a lie, and lies are the one currency this household does not trade in. What happened instead was slower, harder, and more valuable than any romance novel could capture in a single chapter. What happened was partnership. Within 3 days, I had access to every financial record in the Drago organization. Within a week, I had identified 14 inefficiencies in the legitimate supply chain that were bleeding revenue at a rate of approximately 11% annually. Within 2 weeks, I had restructured the accounting system, fired one accountant who had been skimming, and presented Cassian with a 42-page analysis that reorganized the entire European distribution network. He read all 42 pages. He asked 17 questions. He implemented every recommendation. Nobody had ever read anything I wrote and implemented every recommendation. Nobody had ever looked at my handwriting, the precise, sharp letters that my mother called unfeminine and my father called unnecessary, and said, "This is exactly what I needed." The staff watched me with a wariness that slowly melted into something closer to respect. Mrs. Ferretti began leaving fresh coffee on my desk at 6 in the morning, which was how she communicated approval in a household where words were rationed like ammunition. The groundskeeper started bringing me reports directly, instead of routing them through the consigliere. The kitchen staff learned that I preferred simple food, bread, olive oil, strong coffee, fruit, and stopped trying to impress me with elaborate dishes that nobody had time to eat during a 12-hour workday. Cassian and I developed a rhythm. He handled operations. I handled numbers. We worked in the same office, a massive room with 2 desks pushed together, because separating them had felt impractical, and then, gradually, had felt wrong. We drank coffee from matching cups. We argued over projections, real arguments, the kind where neither person concedes because both are right about different things, the kind of argument that ends not with a winner, but with a better answer than either person started with. He never once commented on my body, not my weight, not my size, not the way I looked in the practical dark dresses I wore instead of the designer gowns Viviana had paraded through our father's house. He commented on my analysis. He commented on my logic. He commented on the way I could read a financial report, the way other people read novels, with absorption, with intuition, with the ability to see the story hiding in the numbers. The first time our hands touched, it was an accident. We were both reaching for the same transport manifest, and his massive fingers brushed against mine over the paper. The contact lasted less than a second. He pulled back. I pulled back. Neither of us mentioned it. But for the rest of that evening, I was hyper-aware of the distance between our desks, 3 feet, 4 inches, and the way that distance had somehow become the most measured space in my entire mathematical life. He began leaving notes in the margins of my reports. Not corrections, observations. Small, precise notations in his sharp handwriting that said things like, "Excellent catch, missed this across 3 prior audits," or "The logic here is airtight, implement immediately," or once, just a single word circled at the bottom of a particularly complex analysis. Brilliant. I kept that page. I pressed it flat in the back of my personal ledger, the way other women pressed flowers. I pressed the word brilliant, written in the handwriting of a man who did not use words carelessly. One night, very late, the kind of late where dawn is closer than midnight, I looked up from my work and found Cassian asleep at his desk. His massive body was slumped forward, his head resting on his folded arms, his dark hair falling across his forehead in a way that made him look not younger exactly, but less guarded, less fortress, more human. I could see the thin white scar through his eyebrow. I could see the exhaustion that lived permanently in the lines around his eyes, the grief he carried for his first wife, like a stone in his pocket, always present, never displayed. I stood up. I took his heavy wool overcoat from the back of his chair, the same coat he had draped over my shoulders in the cathedral 5 weeks ago, and I laid it gently across his sleeping shoulders. He stirred. His dark green eyes opened, unfocused, and found me standing above him. "The Messina projections," he started. "Can wait until morning," I said. "Sleep." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he closed his eyes, and I went back to my desk, and I worked until dawn, and I did not look at him again, because looking at him while he slept felt like reading a page of a book that I hadn't been given permission to open yet. But I wanted to open it. And that wanting, quiet, patient, growing, was the most dangerous number I had ever calculated. One evening, very late, the kind of late where the coffee cups are cold and the candle has burned to a stub and the rest of the household has been asleep for hours, he looked up from a report and said, "Why did you come to the cathedral?" I set my pen down. "What?" "You were hiding in the vestibule, in the shadows. You weren't invited, but you came. Why?" I thought about it. I thought about the wilted rose, and the worn shoes, and the faded plum dress, and the 26 years of being the ghost in someone else's story. "Because I wanted to see it happen," I said. "I wanted to watch them take the last thing I had. I wanted to stand there and feel the anger instead of pretending it didn't exist." "And what did you feel?" "I felt invisible." I paused, "until your boots started clicking on the marble. Then I felt something else." "What?" "Curious." The faintest movement crossed his lips. Not quite a smile. Something closer to the expression of a man who has found something valuable in a place he did not expect to look. "I read your transport optimization analysis 11 times, he said. "Before I ever agreed to this marriage. 11 times, Isadora. I memorized your handwriting. I recognized the way you built arguments. Precise, unsentimental, ruthlessly efficient. I fell in love with a mind before I ever saw a face." He reached across the desk. His massive hand, the hand that had extended toward me in the cathedral vestibule, the hand that had promised "I have you" without words, closed gently around my ink-stained fingers. "You were never invisible to me," he said. "You were the most visible person in the room. Everyone else was furniture. I didn't cry. I don't cry easily, but something inside me that had been locked for 26 years, the door behind which I had hidden every unacknowledged hurt, every stolen opportunity, every time my mother's eyes slid past me to land on Viviana, cracked open, and the pressure released, and the silence that followed was not empty but full. Months passed. The Drago estate transformed. Revenue increased by 31%. The legitimate businesses expanded into 3 new markets. Staff morale, measured not in surveys but in the specific, observable metric of whether people stayed, was the highest it had been in a decade. Mrs. Ferretti smiled. Once. It was the organizational equivalent of a standing ovation. Then, one evening, Cassian tossed a letter onto our shared desk. It bore the seal of a southern Italian legal firm. "News from the South," he said, leaning back in his chair. I picked it up. I read it. My father's creditors had forced the sale of the family townhouse. The debts he had hidden behind bluster and borrowed suits had finally surfaced. Years of bad investments, unpaid suppliers, and the catastrophic cost of maintaining the illusion of wealth when the wealth had evaporated long ago. The family had moved to a rented apartment in a seaside town, very small. My mother was reportedly working for the first time in her life, managing accounts for a local shop. The irony of that was not lost on me. Viviana had been hastily married off, not to the powerful man my parents had promised her, to a local businessman, 57 years old, stern, humorless, who reportedly demanded a quiet, obedient wife. Viviana Santoro, the blooming rose, the golden child whose smile had conquered every room, married to a man 36 years her senior who had no interest in roses and every interest in silence. I set the letter down carefully. The ink did not splatter. I waited for the surge of vindictive triumph. The satisfaction of watching the people who had stolen my wedding, my dress, my future, reduced to the specific, small miseries they had built for me. I waited for the sweetness of revenge. It didn't come. Instead, I felt a profound, heavy indifference. The Santoros were strangers. They belonged to a past life that had burned away entirely the moment I dropped a wilted rose on a cathedral floor and placed my hand in a stranger's palm and walked 47 steps toward a future I had never imagined. "It seems we both got the marriages we bargained for," I said quietly. Cassian stood up. He walked around the massive desk and stopped beside my chair. He reached down and took my left hand, the hand that still wore his family's oversized dragon signet ring, the one he had shoved onto my finger at the altar, still held in place by the thick thread, because I had refused to have it resized, because the thread had become part of the story, and stories should not be edited for comfort. He pulled a small, worn velvet box from his jacket pocket. "Take it off," he commanded softly. A sudden spike of panic tightened my chest. "Cassian, no, it is the Drago crest. It is my proof. You do not need proof." He gently untied the thread, sliding the heavy dragon ring off my knuckle. He set it on the desk. Then he opened the velvet box. Inside rested a new ring. It was gold, heavy, solid, unadorned except for a single deeply engraved symbol, a compass rose. Not the Drago family dragon, not the roaring beast clutching a sword that had represented his bloodline for generations. A compass rose, the navigational star, surrounded by a wreath of olive branches. Cassian slid it onto my fourth finger. It fit perfectly. The metal was cool, solid, and undeniably permanent. I took the design to a goldsmith in Florence, Cassian said. His voice was low, the rough, quiet voice he used only when we were alone, only when the fortress had lowered its drawbridge and the man inside was visible. He kept hold of my hand, his thumb brushing over the engraved compass. The dragon represents my ancestors. They built this place, but they let it rot. You saved it. You navigated the debt. You mapped the markets. You fixed what was broken. He paused. And you did it in a plum dress with ink on your fingers. He knelt. The most powerful man in northern Italy, 6'5", 260 pounds of authority, a man who bowed to absolutely no one, knelt on the stone floor of a messy office, surrounded by ledgers and cold coffee cups, and the specific, comfortable debris of a partnership that had become something neither of us had the vocabulary for. I did not just marry a donna, Cassian said, pressing a kiss to the knuckles of my ringed hand. I married my true north. You are the only compass I will ever need, Isadora. I leaned forward. I tangled my ink-stained fingers in his dark hair. I pulled him up into a deep, unhurried kiss, the kind of kiss that does not need to be rushed because it has been earned, step by step, ledger by ledger, late night by late night, argument by argument, coffee cup by coffee cup, across months of building something real, in a stone fortress, on a cliff above a wild sea. The ledgers could wait. The projections could wait. I had spent 26 years invisible. But here, in the harsh, beautiful north, in a fortress that destroyed ornaments, beside a man who had walked 47 steps past a beautiful bride to find the woman hiding in the shadows, I was finally, undeniably, permanently seen. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't a grand scheme. It isn't a dramatic confrontation or a carefully planned downfall. It's simply living a brilliant, unapologetic life while the people who underestimated you watch from the sidelines. Isadora Santoro didn't just survive her family's betrayal. She built an empire with a man who truly saw her worth, not the symmetry of her face, not the size of her dress, not the brightness of her smile, but the precision of her mind, the steadiness of her hands, and the quiet, unshakable integrity of a woman who managed impossible numbers while wearing impossible expectations and never once broke. Here's my question for you tonight, and I want you to feel this one. Have you ever been the invisible sister, the overlooked one, the person standing in the shadows at a celebration that should have been yours, holding a wilted rose, watching someone else receive what you earned? And if you've ever stood in those shadows and felt that specific, ice-cold anger, did someone eventually walk toward you? Did someone's boots click on the marble? Did someone stop and look and see you, not as the leftover, not as the consolation prize, but as the first choice? The only choice? Tell me about the person who saw you. I read every single comment. If this story reminded you that worth isn't measured by the eyes that overlook you, but by the eyes that find you in the dark, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. Subscribe, hit that bell, and I'll meet you in the next chapter. This is Isadora Drago. The plum dress is in the back of the closet. The ink stains are still on my fingers. The compass rose ring is heavy on my hand. And I am finally, permanently seen.